It is so good to be together. Thank you for coming down after Mass. Thank you for gathering together in hospitality and in listening and learning and growing and being together, being community. I have the honor of beginning the introduction of Father Michael Joncas, who, as you all know, is an internationally recognized and respected priest, liturgical composer, author, speaker, and professor. He was ordained in 1980 and served as an associate pastor, a campus minister, a parochial administrator at various parishes throughout the Twin Cities and Newman centers in Minnesota. From 1987 to 1922, Father Mike taught in the Theology and Catholic Studies Department at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul. He has a master's degree in Theology and Liturgical Studies at the University of Notre Dame and a doctoral degree in Liturgical Studies from Rome. Father Joncas has composed more than 20 collections of liturgical music, published 6 books, more than 100 articles. There is oh so much to say about Father Michael Joncas. But honestly, he's touched millions of lives in his ministry. On a personal note, I'd like to share that he was the pastor of the church that I went through RCIA in. I had really no intention to become Catholic, but I was drawn to this process. And through the process, I decided to become Catholic. And my parents were very upset. And when they came to visit me after I had become Catholic, they came to worship with me at our church. And it was the celebration of Corpus Christi, the body and blood of Christ. And Father Joncas spoke in the homily. And after Mass, my father came up to me, kind of passionate, and his eyes were glittering. And he said to me, "Janice, if this is what they teach in the church, you are in the right place." And he gave me the biggest hug. And they became great ecumenical partners. But I am so honored to see you again, grateful you're here. I'm going to pass it on to Father Daniel for more talk.
Thank you to Janice. So I'm not going to put Father Joncas on the spot and say, what was it like to form a living saint here like Janice? But so I was also formed by Father Michael Joncas in college at the University of St. Thomas, and remember taking Christian worship, which was one of the best courses that I had during my time. And God was telling me something. I minored in theology and did better in theology than my political science major, in part because I had wonderful professors. One of the things that, just from a human standpoint, as Janice noted, Father Joncas really, it's the hat trick of being an extraordinary composer, professor, theologian, and teacher. And to have all those gifts, but the thing that stands out for me is generosity of spirit. When I think of my favorite priests in the diocese or people that I know, they share faith, talent, generosity of spirit, and humanity, including a wonderful sense of humor. And so we're so thankful for Father Joncas' presence here. This has been a terrific series so far, and just a great collection of different speakers, and it will continue with a couple more talks this spring. But we're delighted to have Father Joncas, who continues to manifest his faith and his generosity of spirit in being with us today. So let's warmly welcome him.
The part I really like about this is to hear, it's been a wonderful series so far. That's exactly right. I'm honestly embarrassed by those introductions. It is very clear to me that's really God who does the shaping and the forming, and some of us are privileged to be part of that work on God's behalf. So I agree with you. Janice is a living saint. And we've got, Dan, how shall we put it? A very fine student who like other people I know, has many, many talents in many areas. I know few people who know so much about law who at the same time are so passionate about social justice. So kudos to you. Why don't I tell you what I'm doing so you can leave if you don't want to hear it. Title is 60 Years After the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, Pope Francis and Liturgical Renewal. So what I could have done is gone back 60 years ago and just worked on that document, Sacrosanctum Concilium. It's the first document that came out from the Vatican Council II. But I decided, no, we need to look at what Pope Francis in the last 10 years or so has been doing to forward liturgical renewal. Interestingly on this, I don't think it's at the core of his heart. I think he's much, much more interested in global issues and in issues of world peace, certainly issues about climate change and what we could do about that. But he's also a Jesuit, which means that he knows everything about everything. I am not one, by the way. So anyway, that's the plan, and let me give you the outline. So there are two things we're going to be looking at. First, Pope Francis enacting liturgical renewal. So we're going to see him doing certain things. And the daily homilies that he did at the Casa Santa Maria residence in Rome, the Holy Thursday foot washing that got a lot of press at the beginning of his pontificate, and then the Mass at Lampedusa, which was the point where immigrants coming from Africa would land. And again, fascinating. It's not so much what he wrote about these things, it's how he enacted them, what he showed us as the possibilities for liturgical renewal. And then three topics, something Pope Francis writes about. And first is in what's called Evangelii Gaudium. It's a document that really gave the entire outline of what he intended to do in his pontificate. So incredibly important, and part of it is on liturgical renewal. I'll give you a little hint. There's some great humor in this section of the document. Second, this one is probably the most controversial. He put out a document called Traditiones Custodes, or Guardians of the Tradition. And that was a disciplinary document. Both Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI had opened up the use of the pre-Vatican II Mass, had opened that up to a wide variety of people. But Pope Francis made the judgment that this was not actually helpful to the ongoing work of the Church. And that was also incredibly controversial, at least in the social media area. And then finally, his most recent work called Desiderio Desideravi, With Desire Have I Desired. It's a quotation from the Last Supper. With desire have I desired to eat this final meal with you. So that's it. And oh, good, there's a watch or a clock right there, so I'm not going to go on too long. Here we go. Let's talk about Pope Francis enacting liturgical renewal by means of his daily Mass homilies. The major thing you need to know is that popes don't do that. They just don't. Up until this time, popes in the modern era would celebrate usually a private Mass. It was not something that you did in community. And you certainly didn't preach at it. No. But Pope Francis, like a good pastor, said, well, if I'm supposed to be the shepherd of the area of Rome, I have to continue to do what parish priests do. I've got to preach in season and out of season. So if he's in Rome, you can see him in the Casa Santa Maria residence preaching. Now notice it's not gigantic crowds. I love that. It's mostly international priests who have a residence there and various workers in the Vatican area. So it's not like he's giving every single day these gigantic perorations. No, he's trying to deal with the real life faith group of people. And I think that becomes then a very strong model for those of us engaged in the liturgical renewal. The ongoing prayer of the people is the most important thing to do. Second, can you see how he disregards the rules? I know that's hard to even think of. And you could probably say, well, the Pope, he can do what he wants. Actually, he can't. He's bound by the church's traditions. But notice, there are flowers on the altar. What? Johann, right there. Would you allow him to do that here? It's a no-no. Right, exactly. And notice the candles, right? They are there, but they're together. They're not in this balanced form that we're used to. And where's the cross that Pope Benedict always had placed on the altar? Right? No, he's perfectly fine to change those elements because he doesn't consider any of them absolutely central to the church's liturgical renewal. His freedom, I think, is wonderful. And then this I absolutely love. His Marian devotion is incredibly powerful. And what I love about this is the kind of artistry that's involved in that shrine form of the Virgin with Child. I hope you catch this. Just as Mary conceives the Word of God and brings it forth, brings him forth, so the preacher, there he is, standing at the podium, brings forth the Word of God for us today, and right next to each other. So do you get the sense? He's the kind of guy that appreciates art, appreciates connecting with people, not just in a rational, idea-based way, but doing it in the ongoing activity of the liturgy. Good enough? Okay. Number next. Now we're going to talk about Evangelii Gaudium. Came out in 2013. It's right toward the beginning of his pontificate. And as I say, this is really kind of marching orders for his pontificate and frankly for the church. So it's a post-synodal apostolic exhortation. What does that mean? It's something that after the synod of bishops had gotten together to talk about a variety of things, then he comes as one that organizes the insights and draws from them what he thinks is going to be helpful for the church. He's basically like a recording secretary who then summarizes everything. And that's the apostolic exhortation. What's the topic? On the proclamation of the gospel in today's world. And of course that opens up all of the different means by which the gospel can be communicated, sometimes by language, sometimes by liturgy, but frankly by a lot of other things that he also lists. If you've been paying attention to our Archdiocesan Synod, you know that the catchphrase that everybody's using is missionary disciples. Missionary disciples. We, the baptized, are called to take on the role of witnessing to the good news of Jesus, and lots of different ways. But here, he wants to explore the different ways, and one of them is going to be liturgy. It's addressed to bishops, the clergy, consecrated persons. I love that line, right? So nuns, monks, members of religious orders, etc., and the lay faithful. This is addressed to all the baptized. Notice, it's not addressed to all people of goodwill. Sometimes these papal documents are aimed at all human beings. That's not it. This is interior to us, namely the baptized. And that's enough. Okay, so what does he say? In some people, we see an ostentatious preoccupation for the liturgy, the doctrine, and for the church's prestige. Woo! Have you ever met anybody like that? Whoa! But without any concern that the gospel have a real impact on God's faithful people and the concrete needs of the present time. Whew. In this way, the life of the church turns into a museum piece or something which is the property of a select few. Now I have a major question to ask you. What do you think of the use of an almuse at Mass? Excellent, excellent response. And almuse, A-L-M-U-S-E. I love this, right? Well, I can tell you what it is. It's a squirrel fur tippet. What's a tippet? Right? What I'm talking about is those of us, meaning liturgy people, who just get absolutely fascinated with the minutiae of the liturgy without making the question, how is this helping us learn the gospel and live it? So that was just playful more than anything else. And frankly, it isn't Roman Rite, it's Anglican, but I thought it would be a good example. So in others, so you got on the one hand, ostentatious museum piece. In others, the spiritual worldliness lurks behind a fascination with social and political gain, or pride in their ability to manage practical affairs, or an obsession with programs of self-help and self-realization. That's the other side, right? And what he's pointing to is the liturgy is first and foremost about an encounter with God. You do that because you want to encounter God. It's not necessarily because you want to make some psychological changes in your life. Now, that might happen from an encounter with God, but that's not the purpose. The purpose isn't a kind of small group discussion group who raise up things for community action. So, pastoral context. Then he says, liturgy forms missionary disciples. The mark of Christ, incarnate, crucified, and risen, is not present. Closed and elite groups are formed, and no effort is made to go forth and seek out those who are distant or the immense multitudes who thirst for Christ. Evangelical fervor is replaced by the empty pleasure of complacency and self-indulgence. Whew. Now, I want to say, this is absolutely true. It could not have been more beautifully expressed. So I'm driving from Christ the King. I had Mass this morning at that South Parish. And so I'm driving here to the Basilica. I get to the crossroads of Hennepin Avenue and then coming up in front of the rectory. You look across to the parking lot and there's a homeless person. And I was also there right at the point where everyone was leaving from church, right? And nobody walked by. The people that were walking by at least acknowledged the person if they then moved on, and a couple other folks were just trying to figure out how can we help. You see, that's the opposite of what he's talking about here. That people have been formed by the liturgy to go out into the world and do the liturgy's work. I will dwell in particular and even somewhat meticulously on the homily and its preparation, since so many concerns have both expressed about this important ministry, and we cannot simply ignore him. The homily is the touchstone for judging a pastor's closeness and ability to communicate to his people. We know that the faithful attach great importance to it, and that both they and their ordained ministers suffer because of homilies. Isn't that hilarious? I have never heard another papal document with a joke like that in it, right? The laity suffer from having to listen to them, and the clergy suffer from having to preach them, right? So it's pretty clear. This is a guy who understands. He knows he's been involved in this kind of work for quite a while. Now, I'm not going to probably read all of this to you, but you can. I'm leaving the PowerPoint in case you want to deal with some more of the stuff. But it's worthy the remembering that the liturgical proclamation of the Word of God, especially in the Eucharistic assembly, is not so much a time for meditation and catechesis as a dialogue between God and his people, a dialogue in which the great deeds of salvation are proclaimed and the demands of the covenant are continually restated. The homily has a special importance due to its Eucharistic context. So he places very high value on preaching, especially preaching at Eucharist. And we can see him enacting that. If you ever go to watch one of those broadcast papal masses under Francis, he's very solemn and really doesn't show a lot of emotion through almost all of the gathering rites and the liturgy of the word. And then he just explodes in the preaching. Energy, images taken from real life, wonderful. And then when he re-enters the rest of the liturgy, he again becomes a kind of solemn figure. He doesn't want this to be a cheap engagement with language. This is a dialogue between God and God's people. So, what are its characteristics? And here's where I'm just going to go through it kind of quickly. It cannot be a form of entertainment like those presented by the media. Yet it does need to give life and meaning to the celebration. The giggle here, and I have some friends that point this out, sometimes a priest and a deacon are engaged in leading the liturgy. And it's Johnny Carson and Ed McMahon. Sorry, Ed McMahon is the deacon, and Johnny Carson, who has the punchlines, is supposed to be the... No, it's not about entertainment, right? So sometimes the attempt to be entertaining actually gets in the way of the dialogue between God and people. Now that doesn't mean that you can't tell a joke during preaching. You can. But if the focus is simply to hear how many jokes the priest can tell, we've really missed out. So it's a particular form of engagement. The homily goes on too long, it will affect two characteristic elements, its balance and its rhythm. I think we have all had the experience of gathering rites that have not only an opening hymn and a penitential rite, but a Kyrie eleison, an entire Gloria, and you've got 25 minutes of all the preparatory rites before you ever get to hear the first reading. That's unbalanced, right? So he wants to say, if those are introductory rites, let them introduce. And then let's get to the word, because that's what we're called to do. Okay, pretty straightforward. Heart speaking to heart. Dialogue is much more than a communication of a truth. It arises from the enjoyment of speaking, and it enriches those who express their love forever through the medium of words. This is an enrichment which does not consist in objects, but in persons who share themselves in dialogue. Now, I think this is especially interesting because he's got a cultural world which is different than North American, I'll simply say white engagement. If you've engaged black preaching, there is a constant flow in preaching, that the preacher gets power from responses of the congregation, and the congregation is then also shot forward with its own engagement with the truth of the gospel. So I think some of that is actually coming also from Latin America, and that kind of dialogue is part of what he's pointing to, which, by the way, doesn't mean that it's wrong for our culture to prefer to show its appreciation by applause or maybe by contemplative silence at the end of the preaching. You get the idea? But it's got to be in some way dialogic. It's enculturated, not ideas or detached values, but a synthesis. So it shouldn't be brainless, it shouldn't be irrational, but nor should it be just a college lecture or what I'm doing right now. There's something more to it than simply communicating ideas. Now, okay, so that's Evangelii Gaudium, and you see that his focus there, beginning of the pontificate, is really on preaching. Okay. Any questions, problems, wonders, hopes, or desires before we move on to the next? Nope, okay. Go ahead. Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. Oh, it's getting there. If I can repeat, I would like, the person said, I would like to hear a woman's perspective sometime. And I completely agree with you. Interestingly, Eucharistic homily preaching is presently not open to females. But that doesn't mean that there can't be liturgical preaching in all sorts of circumstances led by women. Even more, once we get the global understanding of this, rather than just North American, we realize that especially in Africa, if you've got a priest coming in, maybe male, but a priest coming in who doesn't know the language, who can't communicate the way Pope Francis is talking to the hearts of the people, the catechist does it. So the priest gets up and says maybe 2 sentences, 6 sentences, and they're right there. And the catechist not only translates them in terms of the intellectual content, but puts them in terms of people's lives. And that catechetical thing we have hardly ever tried in the United States. But you can see that that's a global issue, not just a U.S. issue. But I'm looking forward to the day when that's going to be possible. Go. Yeah. 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 My big question is, did you hear her? Okay. Could you take that microphone and maybe give us at least the central thing you were trying to say?
So I'm just concerned about when in anything that he's written. I think this is a wonderful thing that he wrote, and I think it's a summary that you're giving us.
Yeah.
So that's fine, because you can only do so much. But when I hear these abstract nouns I see them read and read. Things like needs of the time. The homily should be dealing with the needs of the time. That's you. I mean, if as an English teacher, you would say to the student, open it up.
Exactly.
Demands of the covenant, what are they? Culturally restated. Culture, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And then enculturated preaching also.
Right.
So this all sounds fine. And then when you try to really understand it, or when a preacher is giving a homily, I find they're not very effective because they're not clear. Mm-hmm. They're abstract. Yeah. And it may be fine, but it doesn't carry a lot of meaning.
Right. Thank you, first of all. And actually that moves us beyond this to try to say we need to form our preachers. Now, how shall we put this gently? I'm 73, which means that Vatican II happened when I was in high school. And I think back to what the preaching was prior to that, with the liturgy all in Latin, and you would exit from the liturgy with the sign of the cross, and then you'd start your preaching. The bulletin today tells us that we're going to have a meeting on that's not preaching, but it's an interesting setting of what the community needs to do. And then, well, in the series on the 10 Commandments, we're up to Commandment 4. So I'm going to, again, preaching with no relation to the Scripture. So the fact that I can still remember preachers who were shaped and formed that way and was part of a congregation, then Vatican II happened and new expectations of homilies began to happen. Frankly, we've had a very short amount of time, and the more you can give feedback to preachers, the better it's going to be, in addition to praying for a wider selection of those who are preachers. So I agree with you. Now, here's an example. So I'm preaching today and decide to use the Abraham thing as the final, and then to compare that to the Christ. Okay, the only problem is I didn't get a chance to set up, well, what's a covenant, right? And I know that all 6 of the Sundays in this year's Lent are all covenant stories, aiming us to see how Christ is the fulfillment of all of them. But we don't get to that until Easter. So what do we do today? Well, here's one. What's the difference between a contract and a covenant? Contract's a prenup. A covenant is a marriage vow. Hear it? And I actually did that at Christ the King. But I didn't do that here because I couldn't set up for it, and I thought that was kind of extraneous. But at least that would be a way of being less abstract and more concrete. But I agree with you. We do our best, and sometimes we don't succeed. Any other quick questions? Okay, so now we're going back to Pope Francis as enacting the liturgy rather than writing about it. So, what do you notice? What do you see? Yes, yes. Female and male, with the Pope kneeling before them. He's in vestments and is washing bare feet, which is, again, really interesting. It's not what many of us grew up with, which is washing the feet of clerics. You know, the bishop came and had 12 priests and washed their feet. Or in a parish, the bishop and, the parish priest and a bunch of altar boys. No, he's saying this is something else. This is not just a gesture that's involved in mutual service to each other as Christians, because what also becomes clear is that it's not just male-female. It's also where you're positioned socially. This is a jail. And what you're seeing is inmates, some of whom are not Christian, who are still part of this. And you might expect this has caused great controversy because he's in some ways violating the liturgical rules about how you do the foot washing, but in other ways he's manifesting exactly what it's supposed to be about, selfless service to others. So I find that absolutely fascinating. And he's pretty clearly a model for me. But the problem is I'm now 73 and I can't kneel down anymore. I really can't. So, but we try, right? So there's again an image of his freedom with these liturgical practices. Now, the messiest part of this, and I'm going to put it up, but it's going to take a very long time if I take every element in it and explain it. So all I'm going to do is set it up for you and then say what Francis is saying. The indult, in other words, the release from regular liturgical law, the indult that allowed people to celebrate the Missal of John the 23rd. Now you're saying to yourself, what's the Missal of John the 23rd? It's what Pope John did as his final act of organizing the liturgical renewal in his day. He published it in 1962. And it's simply a revision of what we would all remember prior to the Second Vatican Council. The question then became, if the Pope has, before Vatican II has even started, has set that up as a pattern for us, what should we do now? And what happens is both John Paul II created a response in 1984 which permitted diocesan bishops to allow individual priests, parishes, or priestly societies to use this missal. Now, it's not the Tridentan Missal, it's not the immemorial Mass Missal, it's the Missal that was done under the authority of Pope John the 23rd. And John Paul II said, yes, that's something that these groups can do. But here's the condition. It has to be made publicly clear beyond all ambiguity that such priests and their respective faithful in no way share the positions of those who call into question the legitimacy and doctrinal exactitude of the Roman Missal promulgated by Pope Paul VI in 1970. Do you see it? It's a question about pastoral care, or speaking as a theologian, it's a question about your ecclesiology, your understanding of what it is to be church is frankly embodied and shaped by the liturgy that we do. So, for example, if the texts of the Missal on Good Friday say, "And now let us pray for the perfidious Jews," right? Well, we've gone way beyond that. Vatican II explicitly repudiates the idea that Jews are Christ killers. You can't use that language in prayer, even though it was part of the Missal of John the 23rd. You hear it? So he allows this as long as it's clear that those celebrating in the old rite are not refusing what Vatican II teaches. Now this goes even, so he sets it up. And then we get to Benedict. And he puts out a document called Summorum Pontificum in 2007. It's a motu proprio. In other words, it's something done on his papal authority alone for the use of the Roman liturgy prior to the reform of 1970. In masses celebrated without a congregation, without a congregation, right? A private mass with a single minister. Then there are some rules that you follow. However, in parishes where a group of the faithful attached to the previously liturgical tradition steadily exists, then the parish should willingly accede to their requests. If we've got people whose prayer is so deeply grounded in that prior form that it's actually getting in the way of their faith, then allow it. Celebration according to the Missal of John the 23rd can take place on weekdays, on Sundays, and feast days. However, such a celebration may also take place only once in an individual church or oratory. See, it's not just do it, it's make sure that no one gets the idea that that prior form of the liturgy is actually preferred to the one that Vatican II produced for us. Priests using the Missal of John the 23rd must be qualified and not prevented by law. What qualification? They have to know Latin, right? And many of the priests I know, not just in this archdiocese, but elsewhere, who are celebrating this, don't know the language and really can't celebrate it with any kind of intellectual ability or rationality. May I tell one story? Okay, this was really fun. This was 15 years ago. So I noticed that one of the deacons that I knew was going to celebrate his first Mass, but had decided to do it in Latin according to the Missal of John the 23rd. So as I'm walking across the quadrangle, I wave at the deacon and say, "No, salve diacone," presuming, of course, that he knew what I was saying. And he just stared and then kind of walked on by. Well, the next day, it was wonderful, because I saw him again and he waved, "Salvete, pater." And I'm thinking to myself, you looked it up. That is so wonderful. But then said to him, "Salve, diacone, and I need to tell you, I am fat, but I am not plural. Salvete is a plural form, not the singular form." He didn't know the language, right? So again, you might think of that as kind of snotty on my part. I actually was just trying to say, if you're going to do this, know what you're saying. It's pretty important. Anyway, so anyway, that's the world in which Pope Francis then sends out this document. And like I said, you can read this on your own. I'll leave the PowerPoint. It's probably too detailed here, but you get the general idea. Okay. It's an apostolic letter on the use of the Roman Rite prior to the liturgical reforms of Paul VI, and it's addressed to the bishops, not to individual priests, not to lay people or people in consecrated life. It's bishops. It's their responsibility to oversee this use. And he's pretty straightforward about it. The liturgical books promulgated by St. Paul VI and St. John Paul II in conformity with the decrees of Vatican Council II are the unique expression of the law of prayer of the Roman Rite. See, we've been told, at least in social media, by some folks, that they're equal. You know, you get to choose. Do you want Missal of John the 23rd, the Tridentine Mass, or do you want the Novus Ordo, the present celebration? And what Pope Francis says is, they're not equal. The present celebration actually embodies the reforms of the Second Vatican Council. To that extent, the earlier Mass is defective. Not defective on its own, it still can offer wonderful personal prayer and an encounter with Jesus, but it doesn't respond to the movement of the Spirit that happened at Vatican II. So it's the unique expression, and from that, it belongs to the diocesan bishop as moderator, promoter, and guardian of the whole liturgical life of the particular church entrusted him to regulate the liturgical celebrations in his diocese. So that's for the local ordinary to oversee. It's therefore his exclusive competence to authorize the use of that missal. The bishop of the diocese in which until now there existed one or more groups that celebrated according to that missal needs to determine that these groups do not deny the validity and legitimacy of the reform, to designate one or more locations where the faithful adherents of these groups might gather, to establish the designated locations on days in which Eucharistic celebrations are permitted using the Roman Missal promulgated by John the 23rd. Here it's terribly detailed, Vaticanese kind of language, but it's a legal document, so you begin to understand it. Now, this one I love. The bishop is to appoint a priest who, as delegate of the bishop, is entrusted with those celebrations and with the pastoral care of those groups of the faithful. It's not enough to just say Mass for them. One engages the pastoral life of a community in ways outside the liturgy. They've got to go together. This priest should be suited for his responsibility, skilled in the use of the Missale Romanum, and possess a knowledge of the Latin language sufficient for a thorough comprehension of the rubrics and the liturgical texts, and be animated by a lively pastoral charity and by a sense of ecclesial communion. So it's really interesting that the bishop is given the task of seeing people that might be able to do this ministry. So anyway, it can go on and on and on. Not to authorize the establishment of new groups. Priests ordained after the publication of the present motu proprio should submit a formal request to the diocesan bishop, who should consult the apostolic see before granting the authorization. Isn't that interesting? It's telling you that really the intent of the Second Vatican Council and then the motu proprios after it were simply to allow those people who were personally attached to the earlier form to celebrate it. And then as they died, they would no longer be these stable groups of the faithful. Instead, we would move to the present liturgical form. But what's actually happened in the United States is that new groups have sprung up specifically so that they would only celebrate in the way prior to Second Vatican Council. And Pope Francis is standing against that. I want to get to the part where he gives his central reason. Okay, oh. There we go. Yeah, I think we've got it. Okay, so if you want to read the more detailed stuff in this, I'll leave this and you can. Now, let's go to two things and then I'll be done. So the first thing is to look at the Pope Francis enacting the liturgy again, not writing about it or talking about it, but doing it. A small boat carrying 166 Africans, reportedly from Eritreans, arrived at Lampedusa's port just hours before the Pope's plane touched down. The island is struggling to cope with thousands of illegal migrants, Lampedusa, about 80 miles from Tunisia, is one of the nearest gateways to Europe for Africans fleeing poverty and conflict. So you see a gesture that's actually by Italian custom associated with mourning for the dead. The flowers are tossed into the sea. And for him, this gesture calls to mind all of the migrants who died by drowning on the way to try to come to Europe. So that, as a gesture, is pretty interesting. Can you see what his preaching is like? I don't know if you catch this. You're going to see it in the next slide. But do you see the thousands and thousands of people that are there? This is a tiny island. And for him to be able to call together this many people. Now, do you see that? Right? That's his pulpit, taken directly from the sea. And I love the symbolism in this. If this is the Word of God that's supposed to be leading us on, here's the pilot who helps the ship get to its goal, and that's his task as preacher. Then, look at that. The altar's on top of a boat, right? And again, many people were scandalized by that. Now, we can raise some questions about, is putting this on top of a boat with a bunch of flowers, is that faithful to the idea of reproducing the Last Supper in some way? But he's willing to at least try it to make the point that he's trying to make. We need in this world, your statement, we need, the signs of the times are calling for something in the light of the migrations, and we need to do something about it. And there's a way of looking at it symbolically, right? Now, last thing. This is a most recent document, 2022, and what he deals with there as an apostolic letter is the liturgical formation of the people of God. So he's naming not just bishops, priests, consecrated life, etc. It's all of the baptized. And what he wants us to do is more deeply engage the liturgy. So he says, if you want to know the core issues in this, you can go back to the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, especially paragraph 7. Christ is present in the Church's Eucharistic celebrations, in the person of the minister, in the consecrated elements, in the celebration of the sacraments, in the reading of scriptures, and when the Church prays and sings. So we don't talk about the real presence only in terms of consecrated elements. The real presence of Christ comes to us in multiple forms, many of which are articulated in the liturgy. Through the liturgy, Christ exercises his priestly ministry and sanctifies human beings through the use of perceptible signs. The liturgical celebration is the action of the whole Christ, with him as head and the members of the assembly as body. Now, here's probably his biggest contribution, and he takes this directly from a theologian called Romano Guardini, wrote in Italian and German both. Since the liturgy is the objective encounter with an objective reality, the Paschal mystery, it has its own proper theological content. What are we supposed to do? We're supposed to go through the exterior aspects, the stuff that we perceive as signs by our various senses, and enter then into the realities conveyed. And he has this set up between Gnosticism and Neo-Pelagianism. Don't worry, I'm not going to try to unpack that for you. Okay. We have to develop this symbolic or sacramental worldview, a symbol which makes other greater reality present and serves as a gateway by which to encounter that greater reality. That's how he understands symbols. Now, that's almost directly opposed to the way most people in this culture think about symbols. What do you want? Oh, do you want $1 or do you want a symbol of $1? A symbol means nothing, right? What we want is the reality, which should be immediately perceptible to our senses. But he says that's not the world in which Christians, baptized Christians, should live. We live in a world absolutely radiant with God, And our task is to learn how to go through these perceptible signs to touch the realities. Incarnation. Christ makes known the divine through his humanity. Whew! It is precisely in being human that becomes the place of encounter and entrance to which we encounter God. That's an amazing statement, but it's at the very core of what we believe about Jesus. So, just as human bodies are the gateway to the soul and manifest the personality of an individual, so liturgical symbols function. And the way I tried to explain this to my students is, what I want you to do is go on vacation and take your body with you. Right? No, for us, the bodiliness of our existence is one of the constituent characteristics of who we are as human. And it also becomes an entryway then into the mysterious individuality of everybody else. So, I can go on for a long time about that, but that's at the core of the sacramental worldview. And what are we supposed to do? Two things. We're supposed to be formed for the liturgy. Hint, hint, hint. That's what we're doing right now. We're at catechesis and study of liturgical history, theology, pastoral practices, but to just have that head knowledge is not enough. Formation by the liturgy. Heart knowledge that comes from celebrating the liturgy. Okay. And an encounter with the Paschal mystery, liturgy and ecclesiology, and here, this is what I was actually looking for before. The present Roman Missal, the Missal of Paul VI in its third edition, is the unique theological expression of Vatican II. That's where we go to find embodied in the liturgy what the Church presently believes. And rejection of that missal is not a matter of taste or spirituality, namely, I really love Gregorian chant, and I just hate all of that crap that Mike Joncas wrote, right? It's not just a matter of sensitivity or a desire for particular taste. At core, this is about how we pray together, and if we pray together in the movement inspired by the Spirit that came embodied in Vatican II. So the Missal of Paul VI expresses the entire tradition of the Missal of Pius V and John the 23rd. That whole tradition. In addition, the authentic theological development of Vatican II. To get rid of a prayer on Good Friday, excoriating the perfidious Jews, is a wonderful act. It brings us to a deeper understanding of interfaith relations. You get the idea. And he really pushes this, a renewal of wonder at the liturgy. For it to remain effective and continue to inform us, we must not grow hardened, but instead maintain a sense of wonder at its beauty. And I think, if I can say this out loud, this is part of the reason why Johann is so important. I mean, he has a profound sense of how beauty becomes a way of entry into God. We're pretty good, right? Truth, goodness, and beauty, the three transcendentals. We're pretty good on the truth thing. We've got catechism. We've done, 20 centuries of theology. We're pretty good at that. Goodness, we're actually pretty good at that too. We have a sense of what our moral responsibilities are individually and communally. We don't always put them into practice, but at least we have some sense of them. But beauty is an equal entryway into the experience of God. We do not need simply better celebrations, though these are necessary, nor greater interiority. I'm just so quiet now and I have my eyes closed and I'm praying, right? But an increase in wonder. Wonder, not a vague sense of mystery, but marveling at the fact that the salvific plan of God has been revealed in the paschal deed of Jesus. His cross, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, and his sending of the Spirit. That's all one theological reality at the core of the Eucharist, and its vital power continues to reach us in the celebration of the mysteries. Beauty, just like truth, always engenders wonder. And when these are referred to the mystery of God, they lead to adoration. So he's calling us to a deeper encounter with the liturgy. Get the idea? And now I'm almost done. Okay. It tells us that the art of celebration needs to be increased or deepened in the faithful and also among priests. But, well, anyway, this is fun. The priest can often move between two extremes, rigid austerity or an exasperating creativity. A spiritualizing mysticism, holding the consecrated host up for 2.5 minutes, right? Or a practical functionalism. Yeah, okay. It said we're supposed to do the creed now. Okay. Credo in unum Deum. A rushed busyness, briskness, or an overemphasized slowness. A sloppy carelessness or an excessive finickiness. A superabundant friendliness or priestly impassibility. Right? Do you see how he operates? He operates with binary oppositions and says, don't do that, don't do that. Find something in the middle. Find something in the middle. So, okay. And then his final move is to reflect both on the liturgical year and on the Lord's Day. Now, here's the conclusion that he comes to, this very end of Desiderio Desideravi, and it's a perfect place for us to end. Let us abandon our polemics to listen together to what the Spirit is saying to the Church. Let us safeguard our communion. Is it a wise thing to go into schism over the taste that you have for liturgy? Let us continue to be astonished at the beauty of the liturgy. The Paschal mystery has been given to us. It's not something we create. That's a gift. Let us allow ourselves to be embraced by the desire that the Lord continues to have to eat his Passover with us. With desire, I have desired. And all this under the gaze of Mary, Mother of the Church. So, I hope that was a good introduction for you. You get some sense of how Francis is doing this. So we've got like 2 minutes, but there might be a question. Yeah.
I just have a definitional question. I got a little confused. The Missal of John the 23rd in 62 was a revision or amendment to a Latin Missal.
Yeah, exactly.
That preceded it, which
Right.
is what I learned as a kid.
Ditto, yeah.
And then the Missal of 1970 of Paul VI.
That's the new one.
That's the new one. That's the embodiment of the Vatican, which ended 5 years before
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And Paul VI faithfully, fully represented. Holy cow!
Yeah, that's what we believe in faith. We can't prove it, but that's what we believe in faith.
Right, but I thought Paul VI though is already soft.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. And there were actually even times that bishops had experimental liturgies in which they tried out these new forms. So it's not like they approved the stuff that they'd never heard of before. Yeah. Yeah.
One incident that hit me a long time ago. Pope John came and said Mass in Iowa, I think it was. If anybody saw it on TV, am I talking into it right? And there were quilts hanging, and it was just beautiful. And we had, at that point, most people received communion on the hand,
Right.
the host on the hand. And so the people went up with their very excited, innocent faces, and John Paul just held it up. And then someone whispered to the people holding their hands out, and they went, stuck out their tongues.
Right.
And right then, I wept.
Yeah.
I thought, this is the difference between standing on ceremony and understanding what the church is and how these people came.
Yeah.
And it still makes me cry.
Right. Thanks. You get the final word.
There's a supposed revision of the present Eucharistic prayer to make it more in tune with our dialogue in the United States. What happened to the revision?
Oh, very good question. Where we stand right now, so I'm not going to talk about the Roman canon. That's the single Eucharistic prayer we used, and that's still in the Missal of John the 23rd. What we have now, depending on how you count it, are 10 Eucharistic prayers. There's 4 of them that are regularly used in our worship. So a revision of the Roman canon, Eucharistic prayer 1, a revision based on Hippolytus, a document from the 3rd century, a revision that's basically a grad student project from San Anselmo, where I went. And then the last one is a revision of an Eastern Eucharistic prayer, a Eucharistic prayer of Basil. So those 4 we regularly use. However, many priests only use Eucharistic prayer 2 because it's the short one. Or they only use Eucharistic prayer 3 because that's the alternative to the Roman canon. So we've got those 4. Then we've got 2 Eucharistic prayers for reconciliation. Could be used during Lent or any other time of renewal. Then we actually have 3 Eucharistic prayers for children. And they are not bound in the Missal. That's very interesting. They're still approved, they're absolutely fine, but those 3 are in a separate fascicle because they aren't intended for usual adult usage. And then the last one, the Eucharistic prayer for multiple needs and occasions. And that actually has 4 different versions of this one Eucharistic prayer. So those revisions are still in place, they're still going forward. Now, we have a whole other question about how about the translations? In other words, from moving to one set of English to another set of English. And forgive me, I'm an English major, right? Yeah. Yeah, so that becomes very important to me as well. My only sense is that we may once again revise the revisions because the present forms are not all that communicative orally. When you read them, they're absolutely fine. But when you hear them, and if there's no reading, you sometimes don't know what the point of the prayer is. It's really hard to get to. And knowing the structure of those prayers can sometimes help. Is that good enough? We're all done.
Thank you so much, Father Joncas. Thank you so much. And I just would let you know that the next part of this series